Okay. Good morning for day three of Boss Librarian PD. Back to school. We're getting ready. Our first presenter today hails from Chicago. She is Dr. Andrea Jamison. Take it away, Dr. Jamison.
Right. Thank you so much, Casey. I do want to say thank you for extending this opportunity to me. And I want to let everyone know Casey is very modest. I've always been inspired by the work that Casey has been doing in libraries and the support that she has given to school librarians and advocating for the work that we do and making that known to the community. She has inspired me in leadership, and I know she's going to do a wonderful job as the chair of EMER. So, with that being said, I do want to share a little bit of information about myself for those of you who I've not met formally. I currently work at Illinois State University. I am an assistant professor of school librarianship, and I've been in schools and libraries for about 17 years. Part of that time has been split between the classroom as a self-contained teacher, and the other half of that time has been spent as a school librarian. I've also worked as an academic librarian and as a public librarian. And just given the different vantage points that I've had in librarianship, I can emphatically say that school librarianship is really where my heart is at. And so that's why I am working with pre-service teachers at Illinois State University to make sure that we as a profession are successful in serving our communities. So with that being said, I do want to talk a little bit about my research because my research ties into the book that was recently published by Rowman and Littlefield, which is a part of the Beta Phi Mu Scholars Series, and that is Decentering Whiteness in Libraries, a framework for inclusive management practices. And the reason why I want to share this is because a lot of the strategies and tips that I'm going to recommend come directly from this book, which came about from the research that I've done in libraries. Part of my research is looking at the interplay of race and privilege in children's literature, and also looking at policies and practices in libraries to see how our practices align with policies and to see the extent that our policies either mitigate or perpetuate diversity and equities. So with that being said, I'll try to make this very quick and painless. The purpose of this session is to contextualize a little bit of what is happening in society today with regards to censorship challenges. Um, Censorship is not new in libraries. We've had a history of dealing with various forms of intolerance, and I think it's important for us to discuss the history. There was a writer that once said that a history that is unexamined is doomed to repeat itself. So I think it's very important that we look at history as we're thinking about the future and how we are going to respond to what is happening given this socio-political context that we're in right now. I think history has a lot to teach us about what we need to do, specifically as it relates to the timing of our response. I think that is so significant and so important. So we'll have that discussion. I'll also talk a little bit about the value of diversity. I know diversity is a very polarizing term right now. I know that in some instances, it's the elephant in the room, but diversity is very much still a value for American democracy. American democracy is built on diversity. So it's a conversation that I feel that is not going anywhere despite legislation. It is something that I think is still important to the role of librarianship. And as much as people try to silence conversations about diversity, we as librarians, because libraries as institutions represent the idea of democracy, we have to make sure that we keep the conversation about diversity to the forefront because that is essential to our professional responsibilities. And then I'll provide you with some tips and some strategies that I've found to be very effective with regards to preserving equity for young adults. So I want to start by just having a conversation about censorship. Right now, we may feel like to some degree, the what's happening now with the uptick of censorship across the country with challenges against various books, specifically books representing marginalized communities, namely African Americans and members of the LGBTQIA plus community. We may feel like this is an unprecedented time, but intolerance, and I'm going to use the term intolerance because that is the framing, or that is the term that the American Library Association has used. So I'm going to use intolerance, although I'd argue that this is more about erasure, as much as it is about intolerance. But intolerance is not new to librarianship. If we think back to 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson, when segregation became the law of the land, um, we often talk about that in the context of schools being segregated, but we don't have enough conversations about the fact that libraries were also segregated as well. Whereas you had libraries in the South did not admit African Americans to libraries. And in some cases, African Americans were only permitted to enter a library in the South if they can prove that they were trying to use or check out a resource for the benefit of a white person. So then you had this tension. The maltreatment of African Americans in libraries was one aspect of intolerance that was manifesting in the history of libraries. But on the other hand, you had tension within the field of librarianship itself, which is very important for us to pay attention to so that we can make sure that as we approach these issues today, we're thinking about how there can be continuity in practice across the field of librarianship, meaning that whatever we say the role of librarianship is, whatever we articulate as our core value, it cannot be something that only a few librarians are articulating. It has to be something that it is intrinsic and that is valuable to all of us as librarianship. So we all need to say the same thing, and we all need to make sure that our practices are aligned so that the community is getting the same message about the importance and the value of libraries and what we as an institution of librarians that we do. So there was tension within the American Library Association itself. With regards to, now mind you, 1896, the passing of Plessy versus Ferguson happened, but the American Library Association was formed in 1876. And I want you just to hold on to that point because I want to circle back to that. And so in the discipline of librarianship, you had librarians who were African American. They were not on equal footing with librarians who were white, so with their white counterparts. So you had also in the North, you had librarians who were allies to what was happening in society, and they were active and involved. They were actively involved in social justice work. They were at odds with librarians in the South. So you had the Northern librarians at odds against Southern librarians. And if you think about what's happening today, as we're seeing the trends that are taking place across this country, where you have Southern librarians pulling away from the American Library Association, I think that's something that we need to pay close attention to in terms of the message that we're communicating to our larger or our broader audience. So the American Library Association attempted to address all of the social intolerance that was taking place in society. And it wasn't just what was happening in libraries. They were also trying to address what was taking place in the world at large. So you had African American civil rights leaders that were calling on the American Library Association to speak out against the maltreatment of African Americans. But then you also had Jewish leaders who were asking the Library Association to speak out against what was taking place in Germany, particularly as it relates to the oppression of millions of people and the maltreatment of millions of people, as well as book burnings that were taking place in Austria. And the reason why leaders were calling for the American Library Association to speak out is because the American Library Association has always been viewed as this idea of democracy. The reason being because in the 1800s and also in the early 1900s, books were considered a to give value to knowledge. So, and it also attributed to class in society. So if you were a person of a higher social standing, because the issue of social injustice in society, historically and today, is not limited to race. It's also, we're very much classes as we are races in society, and that has been historically proven. But in society, if you had access to books, you were considered to be a part of the upper echelon of society. Think about in 1812, when the British fought America and the Library of Congress was burned. The library was burned, all of the books and the manuscripts were burned. There was a reason why the library was attacked, because the library was seen as a place where people could uplift themselves and have access to knowledge regardless of their social and or economic status in society. So libraries have always been a place that has been attributed as a cradle of democracy, which is what Andrew Carnegie called libraries. And so given the state of libraries and what libraries represent, this is why leaders were calling on the American Library Association to speak. And as we're thinking about what's happening in society, we want to put that in context, because librarians, we should feel empowered just because of the work that we do and what we represent, being in libraries to speak out against injustice. And so the American Library Association responded in 1939. Right? From 1896 to 1939, it took some time for the American Library Association to respond, which is one of the major criticisms historically the American Library Association has faced. And so I want to highlight that, because one of the things I always tell my students is, as we're doing this work, we cannot be slow to respond, because if we are slow to respond to injustice, that emboldens those who are trying to impress groups that are marginalized. We are giving them time to gain that momentum that they need to not only to take to where it becomes a domino effect. So you can take an issue or a problem that starts off relatively small, and we give it room to grow larger. So it's very important that we are really thinking about our timing, when and how we respond to what is happening in society. So 1939, the American Library Association adopted the Library Bill of Rights. The Library Bill of Rights is very important to the work that we do now, because it is the Library Bill of Rights that articulates what First Amendment rights look like in library settings. I tell students that I work with, it's very important that when you are in school libraries, especially, that you're having conversation with your administration, and you're also having conversations with your community at large about the Library Bill of Rights, because oftentimes people tend to view school librarians mainly as just classroom teachers. So we have to make sure that we're letting people know what our professional obligations are and what our roles are within a school library setting. And so another reason why I bring this up to the forefront, because if we're not sharing what it is that we are supposed to do, then oftentimes our administrator will sometimes gloss over some of these issues and sometimes engage themselves in practices that are antithetical to the work of librarianships and definitely to the Library Bill of Rights themselves. It's important that we are communicating the Library Bill of Rights, because again, they articulate what First Amendment rights look like within library settings. And even if you are in a school library, your minor students absolutely have First Amendment rights. And those First Amendment rights have been established by legal precedents. If you look at what happened with Pico versus Island School Districts, you have had students and you have had parents to fight to maintain their right to read. If we're thinking about organizations today, and I like to have this conversation because I love a good book challenge. If we think about these organizations today, like Moms of Liberty, they're not just fighting against school libraries and libraries, and they're fighting against students, and they're also fighting against parents. Because according to the Library Bill of Rights, your students have First Amendment rights, which means they're only their parents can limit the books that they have access to. And that is the parent of that particular child. So one parent's rights end where the next parent's rights begins. So Moms of Liberty who argue and articulate that they're fighting for the rights of parents, they're actually fighting against the rights of other parents. So as librarians, it's important for us to educate our parents of their rights and the harm that some of these groups, these grassroots groups are doing as it relates to trying to erase the representation and the voices of communities that represent the pluralistic society that we live in, which undergirds our democracy. And if no one has said it, I will iterate it here. I will make it plain. Our democracy is under attack. When you attack a library, you are essentially attacking democracy. And so back to the Library Bill of Rights, the Library Bill of Rights, I won't get into it today, has been harshly criticized, one, because it was a slow response. It was a slow and tepid response to what was happening with regards to social justice and the maltreatment of African Americans and what was taking place in Germany and in Austria. And what happens when you are passively trying to approach issues of where people's rights are being suppressed. Dr. Martin Luther King said it best, where it says that the voice of the unheard becomes riot and protest. And that's what happened after the Library Bill of Rights were passed, because the Library Bill of Rights are guidelines and principles that librarians are encouraged to follow. I personally believe that the Library Bill of Rights need to have teeth. The American Library Association is the oldest and largest library organization. It really baffles me why the Library Bill of Rights don't make the core values part of the accreditation process, and they hold organizations accountable when they step away from the American Library Association. When you step away from the American Library Association, and yes, you can say Andrea said it, you need to have your accreditation under scrutiny. That needs to be held. That needs to be brought to light. But I digress. So one of the things that I think that we as an association need to do is that we need to really buy in to the American Library Association Bill of Rights, which means that we need to begin to bring this language to the forefront as part of our branding. We support the rights of our patrons, the First Amendment rights of every person to be visible, to be seen, and to be heard in libraries. And again, the danger in not learning from what has happened in the past is that we can be doomed to repeat itself. It can be doomed to repeat. And as we think about that in the context of what's happening today with censorship, think about how, and I am a huge fan of the work of Michelle Alexander. Those of you, if you have not read the book, The New Jim Crow, I advise you to read the work. One of the points that Michelle Alexander makes in this book is an argument that racism is enduring. That's how it can learn to survive for generation through generation. What it does is it becomes adaptable. It adapts to the change. So at one point, racism was overt. Racism is still as enduring as it was historically. It's just not as, at one time, it wasn't as overt as it was historically. It was more covert. Now we're starting to see the manifestation of years of covert racism, because the same way that within, and this is again, Michelle Alexander, she said what has happened historically is that racism was codified. We're starting to see that today. It was codified with the criminal justice system. Now we're starting starting to see it become codified within libraries. So now you're starting to see laws that are trying to codify racism and discrimination and the erasure of a people. What is our counter to that? I am a firm believer that as libraries, which is why my work is vested in policy, that if racism is codified, we have to do our work to make sure that we are codifying justice and that we are codifying social justice for people to make sure that we are preserving their rights. Just in the interest of time, I am just going to briefly mention that if you have a chance to look at the history of Tim Hazar and his work, where he talks about libraries being in fact a replica or this idea of democracy, the conversations about the role of libraries. I talk about this in my book. We contribute to social capital. We, especially if you are in a classroom, the work that we are doing, we are preparing students for their civic responsibilities. So because we are preparing them for their future roles in society, why would we not provide them with access to varieties of books with multiple perspectives so that they can understand the pluralistic society in which they live in, so that they can be able to run, they can be the next generation of leaders for our future. My work in libraries has been vested in policies and talking about how policies impact the work and guide the work that we do. Policies are important because they hold us accountable and they make the work that we do very transparent. So with that being said, let me just jump really quickly into some of the recommendations. Of course, again, this comes from my research where I've looked at hundreds of policies, and in looking at those policies, I've found that specifically, I've read a lot of policies where we would articulate that we have a commitment to diversity. And I've read policies that were 400 pages long, and you will have one lone statement that says, we value diversity, but nowhere else in the other 399 pages of that policy has diversity been articulated. So diversity has not been specified, and diversity has not been embedded throughout the policy, which in and of itself, if you do any research within messages and discourse analysis, something that is important is explained and something that is important is repeated. So we have to look at how we are writing our policies. So the first thing that we want to make sure that we are doing is that we need to make sure that we are writing policies that are specific to diversity. We have to name communities. We have to make sure that we are being transparent, and we have to let our communities know that we are intentionally selecting books representative of marginalized communities. And because it is our professional obligations and it is our core values, and it's not because we are just trying to push our own ideologies on students. We don't teach students what to think, we teach them how to think. And a part of teaching them how to be critical thinkers is helping them be able to evaluate multiple sources of information for authoritative and for credibility, which is what Paulo Freire argues, is that education should serve as a function of liberation. And part of liberation is being able to question what is happening in society, because it's through questioning that we find our own answers. So that's what we do as librarians. So creating policies that are airtight, specifying the diverse communities that you are intentionally trying to represent. You need to make sure that you enumerate diversity. And by enumerate diversity, you need to make sure that you are saying, how do you acquire diverse books? What steps do you take? Because we often assume that librarians are on the same playing field when it comes to their commitment and their understanding of diversity, and that policy ensures continuity of service. I always argue, and this is the last point I'm going to make, it is unfair when you have a librarian that is committed to diversity, because that's naturally a part of their practice in an institution, and then another librarian comes in who may not have that same commitment, maybe because they have not been supported through our programs and they do not have the professional development, but they need that policy to serve as a guide. Policies represent the collective consciousness of an organization. So the first thing we need to do is we need to look at our policies. We need to make sure that our policies are not just district-wide policies that have these benign statements of diversity that actually they say nothing and they do even less. We need to make sure that we have policies that are clear-cut and that codify our commitment to diversity. I am so sorry. That is my time. I sometimes get really stuck on the historical aspect, but Casey, I will absolutely share my PowerPoint presentation. And if you have any questions, I'm at Illinois State University. You can find me on social media. We can continue this conversation.
Now, if you are not awake, you definitely are now. I told you she was going to bring the heat. That's why I scheduled her to be the first person to open up today's sessions today. Yes, we do need another hour with Dr. Jamison. um, Especially with some of our us working in school districts where we are dealing with closures of library positions and programs. There's a wealth of information here in her book that you can use to quote when you are dealing with the school board and also writing um, argumentative statements against what is being put out by your school board or your state superintendent. Andrea, if you don't mind, can you scroll back to the cover of your book so everyone can see it? And if somebody could drop that in the chat, I know it's on sale through Amazon. If somebody could drop the title in the chat as well, that would be helpful. Decon Lord have mercy. Decentering Whiteness in Libraries, Dr. Andrea Jamison. So it is available through Amazon and other booksellers. Thank you for including that. Appreciate you. Appreciate you. Thank you, Clarissa, and everyone. Everyone, give Dr. Jamison some love in the chat. Thank you so much, Andrea, for coming through today. And yes, this book should be a policy read for MLIS students in all four divisions. It really does. All right. Thank you much, hon. Appreciate you. All righty. Take care, hon. Stop the recording.